colors, generally speaking. She introduced quite a bit of color into the house, which Mr. Wright found very welcome, and he asked her advice when he was building buildings, and she would help with the color schemes of the buildings.
Her first mission in her life, she said, was his health, to make sure that he ate well, that he slept well, that he exercised well, and also to surround him with people, with people and with an environment which would be conducive to a creative life. And she said in relation to that, she said, you know, Bruce, I ruled him, but I ruled him with love.
Mr. Wright was an architect of buildings and Mrs. Wright was an architect of men. And the combination of the two produced an extraordinary architectural school.
Mrs. Wright really became not only my teacher, she became my friend. She really became my mother.
Practically everything I know about life, I learned from her.
You would be doing things you'd never dreamed of doing, from upholstering chairs to cooking to, I mean, I always cooked, but not for so many people, and dance and music.
I think if you know one thing very well, deeply, in many myriads of aspects, one thing, whatever it is, even cooking, even cleaning the house, even washing the laundry, when you know something very well, you get hold of the principle, the interior principle, then you can do anything else you wish to do, and it will be good. Many times even a deep kind of revelation can occur in a very common, ordinary event.
She could sense uncannily where a person was, you know, who they were at their core, what they needed, where their weakness was, where their strength was, what kind of person they were.
And she studied everybody and really decided how she could help them improve, to mold the people who were here into more interesting personalities, I would say.
She invited me for dinner and there were all these people around and I hardly spoke at all. I was so terrified, really, that I hardly said a word during the whole dinner. And next day she called me in and she was very angry with me and she said, you can't do that. You can't accept the dinner invitation, come to dinner and not say a word. You know? I felt so terrible about that.
Everyone who knew Mrs. Wright had their own personal relationship. It was something only known between Mrs. Wright and that person. And that is the way she talked. I mean, every conversation was a confidential conversation, not in terms of secrecy, but just in terms of meaning and purpose and intensity. I mean, many people go through life never having one conversation, the kind of which one had with her at every meeting.
If you were not seeing something, she was quite capable of waking you up. And sometimes if that was done in a gentle way, it was done in a gentle way. If it couldn't be done in a gentle way, it was done in a harsh way.
She often would press me to get angry.
You would work and give your all and then have Mrs. Wright say, you know, why are you holding back?
She could deliver a blow, but so gracefully that, you know, you would be just torn to pieces. I mean, you would feel like you were completely defenseless and helpless. And then in the next few minutes, she would repair you. You know, take the pieces and put them back together, and you were whole again. And it felt so good that you forgot to be angry.
I saw her with tremendous force, but Mrs. Wright, you know, could put it on and if she needed to use it. She was a wonderful actress. I mean, she would put it on without it affecting her, but the result with somebody else was something frightful.
Some may have been at times deeply challenged, even hurt, may have felt more attacked than they might have from other acquaintances. But at the deepest level, I don't believe there's anyone who wouldn't have to acknowledge that there was a powerful sense of love that came from her.
There's no such thing as an ordinary man, and at first maybe you can say how everybody looks alike, but you know them. A little more, you know, there is individuality there, but it's tucked in deep somewhere, you have to pull it out because it's covered with conventions.
She was a master of relationships. She knew how things went together, and for her, virtually all problems, be they financial or structural or scientific, they were all human problems.
She understood power. She always wanted to be at the center of things, often at the expense of not allowing people to have a part of it. She wanted always to be a third party to every relationship of two. She felt she can always improve a situation by being a third party to it.
I think there was a conflict between the immediate family and the larger family of Taliesin. And I think often that my grandparents chose to deal with the larger family and whatever problems there might be there, rather than the immediate one of my mother, really, and then her sister Svetlana, who died later on. My mother resented it and felt angry about it, that her parents were not always there for her. They had other things to do.
My first memory of my mother is giving me a bath in the big room, in the big bathroom with the sunlight tub. I was about 3 years old. She lifted me out, and then she dried me, and she said, "Are you my little body? Are you my little soul?"
My mother is an extraordinary woman, and very gifted and very brilliant, and was quite beautiful. And you know, you get 3 people with similar talents like that, similar qualities, and you've got a difficult situation. You know, it's not your regular nuclear American family.
You see, my father had a terribly jealous nature. He was violently jealous.
It wasn't a peaceful, easy relationship with no struggle all those years. Mr. Wright was a strong man and she was a strong woman, and they were equal.
Once when poor mother tried to learn the cello and was practicing, he was violently against it. He said to me, "Oh, listen to that poor woman try to play the cello and the terrible sound she makes." So poor mother had to stop the cello.
It seemed that both my grandparents provoked very strong responses in people, and so did my mother.
They differed greatly. Mother, of course, had been schooled by Mr. Gurdjieff to repress negative emotions, for example, not on certain occasions to show temper, to abide by life. My father hadn't been schooled in such a way, no.
She pushed people all the time. She pushed them to their extremes all the time, and that's a difficult way to live.
But he could also be pretty strong, pretty tough too, and usually harder on the people closer to him.
They loved each other so much, and yet they fought a lot. They fought an awful lot. They even fought over me. There was no family who was closer knit than the 4 of us, my mother and father and sister and I.
Svetlana, the older daughter, was married to Taliesin architect William Wesley Peters. They had 2 sons.
Svetlana died so suddenly when she was 29.
Without a doubt, the most traumatic loss ever suffered by Olgivanna Lloyd Wright took place in the summer of 1946. It was the untimely death in an auto crash of her older daughter, Svetlana. She lost control of the Jeep on her way from Taliesin to Spring Green, and it flipped over. Svetlana was killed, along with 2-year-old Daniel and her unborn child. Only Brandock survived.
I was fixing up Mrs. Wright's room when she came in the door, and she said, "Go away, go away." And she burst out crying. And of course I was too.
So sad. Terribly sad. I would try to figure it out. Why do things like that happen? Why? Or I never receive an answer.
Many years later, Mrs. Wright remembered how her husband had helped her to cope with this ultimate tragedy.
He said, "Don't stay still a minute. Come, we will go in the living room." It was a Sunday. "Come out. Start immediately. Don't stop. Keep working. You'll come out of it." It was very hard then too. But I took that upon myself. Don't stop. You must pick this up right away. Put your arms under it. Carry on now, no matter what. Go, move. And that's where he helped me in the very difficult first years.
Mrs. Wright, after Svetlana's death, was so unhappy and lived such an inner life that she couldn't break out of it. And she gave up jewelry, makeup, meat, alcohol, and coffee for 5 years. And after 5 years, that was the time when she really completely came back to us.
The impact of Svetlana's death on the Wright household was immeasurable. Mrs. Wright put it this way in her book, Our House. "Since the tragic loss of our daughter Svetlana, the consequences of the blow are still in existence here at Taliesin. Memories live not only within us, but in the very songs of birds and the swaying branches of pine trees and birches, and in the fragrance of blossoms. These are the traces of our living sorrow that the flow of time cannot erase." The tragedy sparked an explosion of creative energy. She wrote books, she composed music, and she collaborated with Jovana on the Taliesin festivals of music and dance. These exotic multimedia presentations were not, however, without their difficulties.
The festivals of music and dance, like everything else at Taliesin, were extremely demanding. Lots of screaming and criticizing and name-calling, and a great deal of agony in putting it all together.
The fellowship's white-haired patriarch had erected a pavilion at Taliesin West as a home for the music and dance spectaculars, but still he couldn't suppress an occasional pang of jealousy when he saw the spotlight swinging to his wife and daughter. Coping with his outbursts was a major test for Olgivana's powers of diplomacy. In her memoirs, she wrote candidly about her husband's jealousy, but she also wrote about the philosophy that enabled her to cope with it. "The way is difficult," she wrote, "but the aim sublime. Suffering endured in behalf of a great cause ennobles the spirit."
Well, it's philosophy applied to life, not an abstract philosophy, but I believe that whatever philosophy or whatever thoughts or whatever thinking processes we possess, we should instantly transmit into life.
She would write a chapter and then call in several of us, or one at a time, and she would read it to us, or we would read it out loud to her to get that feeling of how it came across from the printed page to others.
Her weekly newspaper columns chronicled everyday life at Taliesin. The more intimate details of her marriage she reserved for her unpublished memoirs. Here, a warmer, more passionate picture of their relationship emerged, one in which a Strauss waltz, played on the radio, could end in lovemaking. "I can never forget," she wrote, "the way he suddenly swished his cape and swept me with it in a way so masculinely beautiful, and holding me in his arms, he started to waltz, which ended in the most beautiful culmination of two people together. I was in love with him, and he with me, until the last.
Mother always wore an amethyst cross at Easter, wore it on a white dress. My father would wear a white suit with his hat and cane, white shoes, everything. He looked very, very tired that last Easter. Very tired. And he didn't want to die. He wanted to live. He wanted to continue. But evidently the thing we call fate ordained otherwise.
Frank Lloyd Wright had lived so long and so vigorously that some of those around him had come to consider him almost immortal. His death on April 9th, 1959, almost on the eve of his 92nd birthday, hence came as an enormous shock. He was buried here in the family cemetery at Spring Green in Wisconsin.
Oh, Mrs. Wright was devastated by Mr. Wright's death.
In essence, she said, I don't think I can go on without him.
She was totally drained. I mean, almost didn't look like a person, and still sat there with great strength talking about the fact that everything would be okay.
She dealt well with it on a worldly sense, in that here she was faced with a business, a world-famous name, 75 apprentices. In that way, she took it like a true soldier. Personally, it was a devastating blow to her. I don't think to her dying day that Frank Lloyd Wright ever left her.
So it made me feel happy when I drove over the hill and looking at the same green hills as I did with Mr. Wright coming here for some 30 years to hear him speak at first, and I continuing it now.
She was now the leader and the responsible one for all that group of people, which was immense problems. There were financial problems after Mr. Wright's death. There were personality and psychological and philosophical questions that had to be answered. Mrs. Wright went right into it without any hesitation.
Could the Wright Fellowship outlive its founder? Cynics predicted it wouldn't last 6 months. Olgivanna knew in her heart that it would survive. She vowed to carry on the school and to see her husband's projects through to completion.
Now he left men behind, and he left me behind with absolute assurance that his work will not die.
Mrs. Wright turned to the composition of music as a creative outlet and for solace.
It was to her, I think, a very much of an expression of her soul, her spirit. It's very hard to perform. In fact, I'd say it's extraordinarily difficult to perform because the notes are not the music. Her music, really, you have to know that spirit behind it.
Mrs. Wright conceived music in a very linear way. She thought of melodies, and in general they are somewhat haunting. I think they have definitely a very Slavic touch to it.
Her method of composing, when she started, was to sing it into a tape recorder. And I would take it and transcribe it and begin to work with it to get the kind of harmony she wanted. And it became a language which she and I could communicate
such a parallel with Mr. Wright, because he would bring us in the morning a little sketch, and we'd have to make a house out of it. And Mrs. Wright was very much the same with her music. The little sketch that she would hum, and she would tell Bruce something about what kind of harmony it should have. Bruce would try to harmonize it and put it together, but if it really wasn't what she had in mind, it would get changed. She had a very clear idea of what she really wanted in spirit, but the technique was, she was not a professional musician in that sense.
A more dramatic use of Mrs. Wright's compositions came in the dance dramas. Here her vision meshed with that of her daughter, Giovanna.
Nothing is lost in the stars, so learn your fate from the all-powerful heavens. It is they who dictate the petty destinies of men.
You have to attribute an enormous amount of the beauty of what was on stage to Giovanna. Giovanna was the choreographer and basically the idea of the whole show.
I would outline the story to her and give her the basic idea and the basic steps and gestures, and then she would compose the music.
It was an incredible way the two worked, but it was not always, I wouldn't say they were always completely happy.
It was 10 of the most glorious years of my life working on her music, from about 1961 to 71. And she didn't do very much music after that. I probably have 50 or 100 hours of her recorded. I haven't transcribed yet.
Through the 1970s, commissions continued to flow in. And, though increasingly infirm, Mrs. Wright continued to lecture, entertain, and travel. It was a brave facade. But those who knew her well were concerned.
Things began to get shaky for her. She told me one day, "Brandock, you won't tell anyone what's happening here." And I said, there isn't anything happening here. But to her, there was. And she wasn't in command of her own faculties as much as she used to be.
When was the last time you saw your mother?
It was in 1983, April 14th, 1983. And the cataracts had grown quite thickly on her eyes, and she had a difficult time seeing me.
But then toward the very end, I came in to announce lunch, and that's when she was really blind. I came in to announce lunch, and I said, "Mrs. Wright, it's lunchtime." I tapped her on the knee. She was sitting in a chair. She said, "Lunch or dinner, it doesn't matter. It's all darkness now."
The penalties of great age had taken their toll. At 3 a.m. on a warm March morning in 1985, Olgivanna Lloyd Wright died at a Scottsdale hospital. The fellowship said goodbye in characteristic fashion. Wrote Edgar Toffel, a former apprentice who had returned for the Wrights. The living room was full of flowers and chairs. The casket was set at a 60-degree angle from the fireplace, the upper half open and draped in Cherokee red velour. Effie Casey played the violin from Mrs. Wright's sonata as Bruce Brooks Pfeiffer accompanied her at the piano. One final surprise remained. Upon her death, Mrs. Wright's long-held request was fulfilled. Her husband's remains were removed from the family graveyard in Spring Green and taken to Taliesin West. There they were cremated and reburied with hers.
He belongs in Arizona because they appreciated him, they admired him.
The shock waves reached from Scottsdale to Madison. Wisconsin's newspapers were agog. The state legislature objected to the removal of its most famous son from Wisconsin soil, but it was too late. Olgivanna and Frank Lloyd Wright were together again. Their shared resting spot is unmarked, but it is suffused with the brilliant color of desert blossoms. Olga Ivanovna Lazarevich Hinzenberg Lloyd Wright, poet, mystic, pragmatist, wrapped in the guise of a fascinating Serbian-accented artist. Partner to the genius of Frank Lloyd Wright, she was the force behind the Taliesin Fellowship, holding it together with brains, blood, sheer psychic energy. I visited Mrs. Wright many times during her later years, and always I came away with a sense of spiritual sustenance. When the musicians played her sonatas, when Bruce Brooks Pfeiffer stood behind her at dinner holding a tiny silver pillbox, it was another world. It was magic. She spent 60 long, difficult years as Taliesin's uncrowned queen, many of them in glamorous poverty. Out of it she emerged not hard, but wise. Mrs. Wright said to me in that intense yet intimate way of hers, something I've never forgotten. When I meet my husband again, I will be able to look him in the eye because I will have kept his name alive. In a very real sense, she was writing her own epitaph, and she knew it.